All right then. Hope everybody's week has been going well, and happy Friday. This is the Alteryx Server webinar series presented by Data Meaning. And as usual, my name is Stephen Morgan, and I am part of the enablement team over at Data Meaning. Data Meaning themselves, we are an end-to-end data solutions consulting group, helping anybody get from that beginning stages of getting your data in order all the way up to being able to do some advanced analytics, some reporting, or any other type of output that you're looking for in order to make informed decisions about the information that you have. So myself specifically, I specialize in the best practices and standardization of the server, as well as any other type of workflow solution, just trying to help get something that is able to be automated and more efficient for what you're trying to build. We are a premier partner with Alteryx and have been working very closely with them to provide as much information, content, and support for the Alteryx community as a whole. I am Alteryx Certified Connect partner and the Advanced and Core Certified. I've been working with Alteryx for a little over 7 years now and have been in business intelligence and business analytics, data solutions, and a lot of IT infrastructure for a little over 13 years. So some of my colleagues within the enablement team are also available on this webinar to help with any questions that you might have or anything that comes up during the course of this. Regarding the webinar itself, this is part 4 of 5. So previously we had done an initial introduction of the Alteryx server. We went over how to scale your environment to a more enterprise level. And then I kind of got a little bit deeper in the weeds and started showing you how do you install, configure, and kind of take care of some of that systemic IT processing for an Alteryx server. This time, we're going to be changing gears up a little bit. We're going to be focusing more on the actual Alteryx Gallery itself and what a user, whether that is a developer or an end user of Alteryx, might be seeing. And then we're going to be rounding out the webinar series in the next session by going over the administrative side of the Alteryx Gallery. All of these sessions are available on the webinars page and will be available shortly thereafter on the Data Meaning YouTube page as well, if you ever wanted to go back, review, or look at some of the content. So with that having been said, I'm going to go ahead and get started into the session. So like I said, session 4, we're going over that gallery user side overview and a little bit of what a user or developer will experience when they're working through the environment. So for our agenda today, the first thing I'm going to do is kind of talk a brief overview of the gallery itself, some of its layout, and then kind of talk about the different roles and permissions and sort of some methodology for how to share and collaborate within the Alteryx Gallery. Now, the last bit of that I'm going to touch in a deeper fashion when we talk about the admin session next week. However, I wanted to at least get some of the wheels turning and get some of it prefaced so that you have an understanding of kind of how the Alteryx Gallery plays with that connection piece and being able to share your workflows and still keep stuff a little bit more consolidated for you as a user to have a little bit of control over it. Then, like I had mentioned, we're going to go on a walkthrough throughout the primary pages of the Alteryx Gallery, and then at the end leave some time for question and answers. So moving right along, jumping into that Alteryx Gallery overview. So when I start with the overview, the first thing I like to tackle is to kind of get an understanding kind of set up for what the gallery is and is not. So firstly, you have two different segments that make up the Alteryx Gallery. You have what is I'm not going to say less secure, but a public facing component to the gallery. And in this, you have the blanketed public Alteryx Gallery itself. Now, when I say public, I am referring to anybody that has at least viewer permissions that can access your local internal Alteryx Gallery. So that does not mean that someone outside of your company or someone that may have expressly blocked permissions into that web front of the Alteryx Gallery can access this, but anybody else that has some authentication here should be able to see what is in public side. Then I kind of break it out into the districts component. Districts are, the best way I could describe them, they're organized folders around what is made public within the Alteryx Gallery. So again, just like the public gallery itself, there is no additional security components. If you can view something in the public gallery, you have access to what is shown within the districts. Then the other side of the gallery is the more secure components. And this is when you start locking down things and you start giving limited access or start restricting who can be using or even having visibility to some of these workflows. So first off, you have what is called collections. Now, collections can be done from a team perspective. I prefer and kind of recommend you use collections from a project perspective. That way, you as a user can belong to multiple collections, and based on what those projects are, you may have different workflows or different components that fit into what gets stored there. And we'll touch on a lot of this as we go through the stuff today. Then lastly, you have private studios. And I'll touch on that briefly in a bit more on this overview portion. But private studios are the lowest level of your own working area, whether that is done from an individual basis or done from a team basis. Private studios are one of those that as a developer, you only have access to one private studio at a time. Moving forward from this, I kind of want to touch in the roles themselves within the Alteryx environment. So the first and major one is your curator. This is the admin role. As it even states, they have access to the admin controls. However, it should be important to note that they do not have access to the workflows or insights that other users have been publishing directly. They can control whether or not it can be downloaded or ran or scheduled, but they themselves cannot directly go to a workflow that they have no permission shared to them and download it or open it. So it is a little bit of a safeguard because you don't necessarily want your admins to be able to go straight into something that might be a little bit more secure. A good example would be something around healthcare or any type of finances where you have a very niche targeted audience or group of people that can be involved with it, and you only want your admins to help in the supporting perspective, not necessarily being able to see some of the inner workings that they may not be privy to. The artisan role is that primary role. It is that developer role within the Alteryx environment. They do have access to a private studio and are the users of a private studio. They collaborate by using a collection, a district, or the public gallery. And one major requirement of an artisan is they are using the Alteryx Designer for building and publishing workflows. A major thing to this is a lot of the time I'll get asked, does the server need licenses? outside of the server licensing itself, you do not need licenses for individual users. However, in order to actually build a workflow and to publish it, you do still need to have an Alteryx designer, whether that is using the Alteryx designer license on your desktop or some other setup that you may have in your environment. So to build a workflow and to publish a workflow, you do need a license, but the server itself does not require individual licenses. Moving along, we have the viewer and occasionally referenced as the member role. This is your end users. These people do not have a private studio, mainly because they are not going to be publishing workflows. They're not developers, they're not building anything. Instead, their focus is to be able to see what is available, to run and access that, and if they are given private access to a private studio or a collection, which is typically what that member status is referring to, then they can look at the workflows and run the workflows that are made available, but they still cannot open the back end of a workflow or do any development work. And viewers are able to access anything that is publicly available, whether that is in the public gallery or within the district. Then lastly, you have no access, which is only going to allow you to go to that initial landing page, but you see no content on it, and you cannot run or look at anything inside the Alteryx Gallery. So essentially, if you are trying to restrict anybody that has not been through a vetting process to access the environment, you might want to set as your default permission, no access. So once we've kind of talked about the roles, some of the ways that you can collaborate is through the use of private studios and building out what is going to be called team private studios. Now, collections, like I said, I prefer to make those more project focused. However, in a default setup, each user, each developer is going to have their own private studio. But in some cases, you might want everyone to collaborate through the same private studio because they're all working on the same workflows continuously. So in that case, you would have your users going into what is called a team private studio. And you can give some blanket permissions to it, which allows them to share multiple types of workflows and to cross-develop. But I do recommend still keeping your collections more project-focused, because then you can take portions of your workflows here and publish them to the various collections so that they're a little bit more organized. It is one of the downsides of having a team private studio is it gets very cluttered when everybody is working out of the same workspace. So kind of speeding along, I'm going to go ahead and start through the bit of the walkthrough. So first things first, you have the landing page of the Alteryx Gallery. Now, like I had mentioned in the earlier portions of our series, we are going to be using 2019.4 as the example for this. So what you're seeing here is our internal Data Meaning Alteryx Gallery and some of what is included here. So on the default landing page, you have a list of the latest workflows that have been published to the environment. You do have the ability to select the latest here and switch it to most popular, which is useful for end users if they're looking for workflows that are commonly ran. And you also have the ability to enter in some filtering here, where you can go in and type in input, for example, and it will remove most of this and just show this PDF input as an option. One of the other things you can do is you can change out of this tile view into more of a list view. So something that looks a little bit more like this. And what it will show you is, again, you can still see the workflow name. You see a designation here through this logo that it is made public, and you can see some of the descriptive information, as well as what type of workflow it is, the owner of it, what private studio might be associated, when was it updated, or when was it last uploaded, and if it was ran manually. Some of the other features that you get, and most of this is going to be prevalent throughout every page of the Alteryx Gallery environment. However, some of the things I do want to point out is you do also have a searching feature. So what that does is that allows you to search for keywords or tags, and it will narrow down what you have available to you. Now, the nice thing about the search is it will find more than just what's made public. It will find anything that you as a user have access to. So if you are part of a collection, it will show those workflows for you specifically. So here's a good example of how this works. You simply go in, type in analytics, and what this is going to pop up is a couple different things. So first off, it's looking for the keyword analytics. So you found it here, and this is going to be a district, and I'll cover that in a moment. But if you notice, this training Alteryx designer here, as well as some of what you're seeing in these workflows, don't have analytics in the name. Instead, they are using what is called tags to help identify and help you organize some of your workflows within your environment. And we'll touch on that when we go into the workflow portion a little bit deeper. So lastly, the other area that makes up this main page is you have this little console set over here. And what each of these kind of refer to is a little bit some supplemental information. So right here is a help guide. If you select this, it will break down and give you some additional information about how to navigate the environment, as well as certain things or definitions that are within it. This is for any shared hyperlinks. So we're going to touch on this a lot more on the admin side, but you can create pages which are essentially articles and create hyperlinks that all your users can get exposure to. And this is great if you are setting up some sort of standards and practices, some sort of guidelines that you want everyone to look into. Any notifications that come up will be located here. And then lastly, if you were to go and select your name up here, you have an area that'll drop in that lets you alter and put some stuff in about your profile. Also, if you are a curator, this is how you would access the admin console, because it will say admin page and allow you to go to it. So you've got a lot of good information off of this. And again, most of what I'm covering here exists throughout all of the different pages here. So the next step that I'm going to kind of take here, because I'm going to end up jumping around a little bit within this gallery, because I like to go from the biggest segment of the gallery and work our way down. So we talked about the public gallery, which is essentially what this interface is. But now let's dig a little bit deeper and go into the district segment. So as you can see, districts are an organized folder type of process. And again, there is no security behind any of these. How districts operate is you associate tags, and as long as the workflow is made public and it matches a tag, it will show up in a district. So for an example here, analytics is the tag associated with this district. So when you explore and go deeper into it, you're going to see each of these different workflows made available that are publicly shared that you can access. When we go and navigate into the workflows themselves, I'll show you those tags that help support and supply the content for these districts. But you can change the icon, you can put in a little bit of descriptive information, and it's a very easy way to kind of navigate people's process in the way of them logging on, trying to figure out where to go. If you have something set up for finance, well, maybe these are publicly available finance workflows that they would need to run. So naturally, again, keep in mind, there is no security behind this. So if you need something that's a little bit more safeguarded, we're going to move into that next section, which is collections. Now, collections are a lot of different things kind of crammed into one. The first thing I want to showcase here is that on our environment, we have about 8 different collections right now. You only see 4. And the reason why that is, even though I am a curator, an admin of this environment, I only own or have shared access to 4 of these collections. That means I don't see any of these collections from a user side. Now, from the admin side, I can look into these collections. However, that does not give me permissions to access the workflows directly that are in them. I simply would be able to observe and know what is in these collections or what users have access to it, and I can help from a more administrative component. The big thing to note with collections is you can specify them any way you see fit, and they come with some different additional content. So you can see the owner, which myself listed for 3 of these. You can see when the collections were created, the count of any workflows or insights that are located in it, as well as any users or private studios linked to it. Now, to add a collection, you can either add one from the workflow itself, if you wanted to create a brand new collection, or you can simply click the Add New Collection. And when you do so, you're going to get a small little window that just asks what the collection name is. So nothing too in-depth, because once you create the name, it will create a blank collection where you only have access to it, and then you have to kind of set its permissions and set all the rest of the stuff that fill into this collection. So the next part, I'm going to kind of step into a collection and show you what makes up this. So moving a little bit further, when you go into a collection, you have a couple different tabs, and we're going to go over each one of these individually. You have the Workflows tab, Insights, Users, and Private Studio. So at the top, you have the name of your collection, when it was created, and the owner. But you also have a listing of all of your workflows. Who owns them? How many times have they manually been ran? And that's an important designation, because a lot of the time you're going to see run count, and unless it is tied to the scheduling, it is only going to show how many times it has been ran manually. And since I am the owner, or I have the appropriate permissions for this collection, I can actually remove workflows from a collection. The big thing to designate here, or to understand, is just because I can go in and remove a workflow does not delete the workflow from the environment. It simply just removes it from the collection. Each one of these workflows that you see here are not duplicated workflows. If I was to go and select this link, it would take me to the private studio specific page that hosts this workflow. So in the way that the Alteryx environment is set up, you are never working with duplicates. It is always going to be referential links, and then whether or not you have permissions to access the original workflow itself. So just like before, you have some additional means to filter. You can select specify analytic apps, workflows, or macros to kind of condense this down. And it is a good area for storing out stuff. Again, this is not necessarily the best example, given that this is listed as enablement team, but I do prefer to use collections as a project-based folder structure. So, for example, if you are part of the finance team, you may have something that is accounts receivable. You may have an internal audit component. It helps to make each one of those separate collections so that you can organize your workflows and keep the same ones that need to run together without any additional clutter. So moving a little bit further, the next page is Insights. Now, I've mentioned briefly before that Insights are a visualization that you can create within Alteryx. And these are semi-interactive dashboarding type of visualizations, but normally they're more used from an auditing or from a error handling perspective versus using it as a tried and true reporting. There are reporting tools within Alteryx that do well for flat files or PDFs. Though if you are looking for a heavier duty interactive type of dashboard, I do still recommend leveraging a more structured environment such as Tableau, Power BI, Click, or the other types that are out there. That being said, the Alteryx Gallery and its environment and the workflows are amazing for reporting tools because they have the means to automate, shape, manipulate, and prepare your data for any other type of deeper analysis or to then push into something like a Tableau server. So this is one of those that I never want to say that it's a discredit to Alteryx because it is a useful tool in certain context, but the gallery itself and the server itself is a monumental bonus to helping you become more automated, more seamless, and more efficient. So it's one of those that I like to play to Alteryx's strengths, which is a lot of that automation, a lot of that collaboration piece. So the next little area here is talking about users. And this is when you can start getting a little bit more definitive about your permissions here. So again, think of collections as a folder where you can create and control permissions and access to it. So as you can see down here, we've got a couple different users. Now keep in mind, you can use any authenticated user or user group. So if you wanted to go and add in an Active Directory group instead of an individual user, one that I see very commonly is like an IT admin or support group to add into the collection, you can do that. You also have some permissions where you can set some expiration dates, which will at that time remove them from the collection. Or you can also go in and alter some of their permissions here. So you can give admin rights to this collection, the ability to add, remove, or update workflows within this collection. Or maybe you have users that's role is to maintain this list for end users that may need access to run a workflow, and they have the ability to add and remove users from here. Now, if you want an end user that can't do anything to impact a workflow, but can view a workflow and run a workflow, you can simply still add them in here, just make sure they have no permissions checked, which will then give them member status to this collection. So when you select the add new users, you get prompted something like this, where you can use the IntelliSense in Active Directory in order to quickly navigate, find that user or that user group, and you can set the permissions and then simply save it off. Lastly, within the collections, we have the private studios. Now, as my own rule of thumb, I do not like to add a private studio to a collection. And my reasoning is this. If you are an individual that is working on multiple different projects or multiple different areas at once, if you have your private studio linked into a collection, if you have this added and you upload or publish a new workflow, it will immediately become part of this collection, regardless of whether or not you intended that. So in my own experience, I'm often working on multiple projects or multiple areas that may have different people involved or different people needing that level of visibility. So rather than have your private studio tied to it, instead what you can do is you can take your workflows and push them to a collection as they're needed, and keep your private studio separate from this. So kind of moving on forward, and this is a good segue into the private studios themselves. When you go into private studio, you're going to see the name of the private studio. So in my case, it's literally my name with the period there. But what you can see is a list of my workflows. And again, just like at the home page, you can do some sorting here, some filtering. You can always go back into that task view, and it will list out any published workflows that may be on the environment. Now, this just shows a couple of workflows available. If you're working with a team private studio, keep in mind that every user that's part of that private studio will be publishing and bringing in their own sets of workflows, which I've seen some get up to hundreds of workflows. So again, this is where things like collections come in handy, because it gives you a little bit more of an option to organize and to try to get a little bit cleaner in terms of your infrastructure. So moving along, we're going to go ahead and jump into a workflow to show you what it looks like on the gallery. So the first things to note is there's a lot of information here. So you can see the name for the Alteryx workflow itself. You can see the owner and the private studio it resides in. Now, the cool thing about the server, and this is one of those things that you get a huge benefit right out the gate with, is you have version control. And when you click on version 3, for example, you're going to see something pop up like this. Now, the cool thing about this little version history window is you've got a lot of additional functionality here. So as you can see, we've got version 1, 2, and 3, but you have this P listed here. This is a designation to say that this is a published version. So let's say you release a new version of a workflow and it's not quite ready for your automated scheduling. It's not ready to be ran by end users. You can go in and say, I'm going to select version 2 instead and make that a published version. It doesn't hurt the one you just brought in, but all of your processes, all of your automated stuff will refer to that published version, whatever that P is residing on. You can also go in and say, well, let me run or download version 1. So you can select it, download it, which gives you a packaged workflow, or you can run that selected version, which does not impact the rest of your environment. This is a great way to build out some version control and get a good handle on the information that is there. Now, the added benefit of a team private studio is you're all working in the same area and bringing in your workflows. Technically, someone in Designer, if they're part of your private studio, can actually download and open your workflow, make some adjustments for it. Maybe they're doing the next iteration and publish it. And rather than create a duplicate, it will create a brand new version. And it will show them listed as the author, when they created it, what version of Designer they used, and any comments that they put in. This is great so that you can see that auditable history behind any workflow as well. And again, all of this stuff is stored within that MongoDB backend, but you have a visual interface too if you wanted to look at it very quickly. So moving a little bit further, the next thing that I want to point out is, once more, that public workflow. So if you have a workflow that's designated public, you will see this icon listed. And like we had shown earlier, you have the logo attached to that workflow as well, so people know it's public. This workflow has never been ran manually, which, as you can see down here, it's been ran plenty of times as a scheduled run, but is never ran manually. So that's a little bit of a misleading thing, but it's a designation to know if someone has manually went over, clicked run, and ran the workflow. The next little area that I want to show is the tags themselves. So get a couple tags tied to this workflow, but the big one that I wanted to point out was that analytics tag. So do you remember when we did our search, we found this workflow because it had this analytics tag, as well as it was part of that district because it was referring to that analytics tag. And tags are very simple to use from a user perspective. So as the owner of a workflow, I can go in and I can hit add tags and just simply go through and check any tags that meet the criteria. Now, as the owner, I am the only person that can go in and tag these workflows, except for someone from the admin side on the admin console adding in tags themselves. And when we go to the session next week, I'm going to show you how to create these tags. And you can also create tags that only admins have the means to add. For example, this production tag. A standard artisan cannot add the production tag. They will go in, they will see it grayed out. They will see that it's visible, but they cannot do anything with it. Only a curator had the permissions to do that. And this is very good if you wanted to set some standards or best practices around how you productionalize your workflows. So moving over a little bit, I'll touch on these four in just a moment, but I want to move over to this side. So as a quick visual, you can always change the icon of the workflow, and you can do what is called replace workflow. So in the event of you publishing duplicated workflows or slightly different workflows in terms of like naming conventions, you can click replace workflow. And what you can do is you can designate a workflow to be brought in as a new version of this workflow, and it basically consolidates it. Normally, you shouldn't need to rely on this too much, but there are moments where if people are not publishing it appropriately, this might be something you can make use of. The big one I want to talk to is the workflow settings itself. Now, the workflow settings give you some additional control functionality over the workflow itself, as well as some means of controlling access. So right off the bat, you have a checkbox. Others may download this workflow. So if you have this unchecked, now as the owner, I can always download. But if somebody else went to this workflow and tried to download it, this button does not even exist for them. This workflow may be ran in the gallery. If this is unchecked, that run button goes away. However, you can still schedule a workflow to run. So this is a good way if you have a workflow there, you want people to see it, but you don't want anyone to run it except for what is scheduled in your environment. You can check others may view this workflow's history. And this is important if you are using a team private studio, because then they can see the list of its run results down here. And when we go over to the workflow results side, you will have an additional tab that gives you access into all of the run history of everybody else's workflows. So it's very useful if you are collaborating. The check for being ready to migrate is a little bit more of a flag, more so than just doing any type of migration. And this is to help you let IT know, hey, we're going to be moving this to a new user or to a new area. So this workflow is good to do that. You can assign a worker node. So you can specify, again, just like I mentioned in earlier sessions, a data science node that runs this workflow in particular. And you can run it in a type of restricted or unrestricted mode. And in our last session, I'll touch on this a little bit deeper. So now, once we've went through some of the settings, I want to show you what the run looks like. So if you are an end user and you click run, you're going to get something that pops up that it's just a simple little interface. You can give a name for the run, you can set a priority if you have permissions to, set the worker if you have permissions to, but simply you can hit run. Now, in the event of an analytics app, you can actually enter in criteria. So in this case, you're entering in some stocks, but you can make this a set of calendars if you wanted an end date and a start date. Or you could go and put a drop down and say, split it up by this particular department. Analytic apps are essentially workflows that allow the end user to add their own parameters to so that they can configure and tweak the end result. And this is good if, for example, you have 5 years worth of data and you want them to go and say, well, I just want from the 1st of January till the end of March, and it'll take that 5 years, parse it down to just that output and provide it to them. So analytic apps is a very good way to have that easy self-service type of analytics. So kind of going back, now the download is a little bit self-explanatory. You click download, it gives you a zip file that is an encapsulated package of the workflow itself and any associated documents and stuff if it was published as part of this workflow. Then you can go and select schedule, which schedule has a lot of functionalities, and I'm not going to touch on it much when we get into the scheduling area here, because this interface is the same that you would see there for editing your schedule. But you can schedule a workflow. You can always enable and disable. You can give it a name. You can set the frequency and how often you want this to occur. So by default, you have hourly, daily, weekly, and monthly, but you can always do custom as well. If you wanted to pick particular dates, you can always check if you wanted it to just run on work weeks. You can set your time that you wanted to run as, the time zone, when you want it to start, when you want the scheduling to end. If you ever do, you can always designate never. You can assign a priority, you can assign a worker node, and you can enter in comments. So you have some pretty good, robust control over scheduling. And this is the main piece that you'll leverage for automation. Now, there are some more advanced ways to handle this where you can start using the API and you can start chaining things off of a schedule. But I'm not going to touch on that much in this series, but you do have more advanced options. If you had multiple workflows that need to run in succession, you can still leverage scheduling and then use an API to, once one workflow finishes, call the next one. And then lastly, what I want to cover here is the sharing. So when you go and click sharing, you have two different things that'll come up. So the first one is this place into gallery. And what that essentially means is taking a private workflow and making it publicly available. So we covered the public workflows and the gallery and how that works. So that's essentially how you designate it. You can also say add to a collection. And from there, you can go and select a drop down from an existing collection and hit add, or you can enter in a collection name and hit create an add. And it gives you a blank collection with this workflow in it and you as the owner. And you would then have to build out your permissions or add any other workflows. Now, one thing to note here, you can actually add a workflow to multiple collections. The downside is you would have to go in, go to sharing, add to collection, select the collection, hit add, go back to it, select another one and hit add. So you have to do it one by one, but you do have that available to you. Then lastly, just a bit more information on the workflow page is you have your description and any hyperlinks you may have included on the designer side, and that is within the meta info tab on the designer when you're working on a workflow itself. Moving a little bit forward, I'm going to move into scheduling. which I won't touch on this too much because we kind of covered the visual component. So you can see a listing of any workflow that has been scheduled within your private studio. So again, if you're using a team private studio, you will see other people's schedules as long as that private studio is set to share scheduling. And we'll talk about that more in the next session. But you can see the workflow, its priority, any worker nodes, the frequency by which it occurs, the state it's in. So in this particular case, I've disabled this first workflow. You can see when it last ran, when it runs next, how many times it ran. And if you went in and hit edit, it's going to load back up that schedule page that we were just looking at. So you've got pretty good control over the scheduling here as the owner of a workflow. And again, if you're part of a team studio and you're sharing it, then you are able to leverage that and share your schedules with one another to help you coordinate things a little bit better. The big area that I want to cover just quickly, but to give you a good idea of that visual, is the workflow results. Now, in the workflow results, if you are part of a team private studio and they have set it up where others may view the workflow history, you will have an additional tab up here that says other workflows. When you select that, you are going to see all of the other workflows that people in your team or your private studio have been running. And for those that have been building and working on stuff within Designer, this is going to look very familiar to you because you have a checkbox here, the workflow, some additional information, when it was ran, how long it ran, whether it was scheduled or manual. But when you click on this down arrow here, you're going to get something that looks like this. And what this gives you is a full listing of everything that took place in the results window of this workflow. And again, all of this is stored in the MongoDB. This is all available to you to reference and pull into other types of processes. But it is nice to have some visibility here. So you can see, okay, file input. I am loading in a CSV here. Here's how many records got brought in. I did a filter. This many were true, this much was false. I can follow my workflow all the way through. I can see warnings, and if an error occurs, it will say error and give you some information. So again, this is essentially the workflow results within the Designer brought up here on the gallery level. And this is something that you can audit through the back end as well. Then the last area I'm going to touch, because I don't have something available on it, is just simply the insights page. And when you go to this, what it's going to do is any insights that are published and available to you will be displayed down here, and you can simply select them and see the visualization and manipulate it. So in a very similar visualization to how districts are set up, this is how insights look if you have some set up. In most cases, I haven't seen many people using insights unless it is for more specific error handling or kind of creating some visualization around the processing of a workflow itself. But you do have that option to share and collaborate that within the Alteryx Gallery itself. And in previous sessions, we talked about the resources and allocating certain things to it. So that covers more or less everything from the user side. So our next session and our final session next week is going to go over the administrative side and kind of how do you configure this, how do you kind of tweak this and put some permissions and lockdowns around it so that you can get the most out of your environment. But as always, please feel free to ask questions. I'm going to leave this time open now for us to talk over some different questions and to answer them. And if you have any other particular questions, please feel free to reach out to me or any member of our team or the sales team at Data Meaning because they will be able to get the right person from the enablement team with you to kind of talk through certain challenges and to help you get the right answers as quickly as possible. So now I'm going to go ahead and open this up, pop in some Q&A and chat open too as well. All right, so if you happen to have any questions or anything that has come up, please by all means feel free to ask them or bring up anything that may come to mind. So, So you received a notification that subscriptions and studios are going away. So I'm going to go off of the assumption that what that means is everybody right now is either working out of their own private studios or part of team studios, and you are making a push to move everything to collections. If that's the case, I would say there is never any harm in building collections. You can build your collections out for teams. The only thing I would caution on it is, just like having a team private studio, it can get cluttered fast. And if you are working on considerably different workflows, having them focused within teams is a little bit, I can see where it can just cause some issues, because you're then having to diversify and to separate out what workflows are part of what. So it can get cluttered quickly. An Alteryx notification. So I'll have to defer to the Alteryx reps in that regard, David, but I have not heard of anything going away for the subscriptions and private studios, at least on the server front. So I'll have to defer to them on that one. But there's never any harm in building collections, and I am a huge advocate for them, because that gives you some granularity and some control over who can access the workflows, who can do what to what workflows are in the environment. Any other questions, thoughts anybody may have? All right. Well, what I can do is I'll probably close this up a little bit early then, but just as a quick recap for what we're going to cover in the next session is we're going to go over everything on the administrative section of the Alteryx Gallery. That does involve, how do you set your permissions up? How do you set up individual private studios compared to team private studios, as well as kind of digging into certain things like tags and how you can start building out a little bit more of a productionalized or standardized process around your particular environment. So there's going to be a lot of content in that one. And as always, we're going to have all of these recorded and available for everybody to access on our webinar page, as well as the Data Meaning YouTube page. And again, if anyone has any questions or anything comes up, please feel free to reach out to us. We're more than happy to help in any way that we can. And I hope everybody has a good and safe holiday weekend, and I'll see you guys next week. Take care.